My name is Ana Garcia. I am 68 years old, and for nearly 4 decades, I was the devoted wife of a man who was admired in our community, a man who carried respect like a second skin. His name was Raphael, and he was the kind of husband who worked quietly, never seeking the spotlight, but who commanded it simply by the steadiness of his character. Together, we built a life that was not grand, but solid, filled with shared meals, church on Sundays, and children who grew up believing that love was steady ground beneath their feet. Our daughter Lucia is 42 now, sharp-minded and determined, always the one to take charge of things, while our son David, at 39, has his father's gentle patience mixed with a streak of stubborn pride. To outsiders, we must have looked like the perfect picture, a family blessed with stability and faith. Yet when Raphael's heart failed one grey morning, all of that security crumbled, leaving me with a silence that filled every corner of the house. I thought grief would soften with time, like waves smoothing rough stone, but instead it settled into my bones, a heaviness that made even the simplest mornings feel endless. I would sit at the kitchen table staring at the empty chair across from me, tracing the rim of my coffee cup, as though its circle might carry me back to when his hands rested on that very table, when his voice was the first sound of my day. My children were kind in their own way after his death, checking on me, insisting I move closer to them. But beneath their visits, I felt the subtle message that my life, as I had known it, was over, that I had played my part, and now should simply wait quietly until my story closed with me. Yet deep inside me there stirred a restlessness, a whisper that said, perhaps I was not finished. Perhaps there was more to be written than widowhood and decline. I am not here to tell you a scandal, though many will call it that. I am here to tell you the truth of what it means to be a woman who dares to live when the world says her time is past. This is not only the story of Raphael's death or the shadow it left, but of what I chose to do when I stood alone at 68 with nothing but memory as my anchor. It is the story of my children, of their love twisted by fear, of their need to guard what they believed was theirs. And it is the story of how I discovered that dignity is not something others grant you, but something you must fight to keep for yourself. It was a warm afternoon when I first met Mateo Cruz, a man of 45 with kind brown eyes that seemed to notice details others ignored, the way the sunlight caught on the chipped wood of my garden gate, or how my hands trembled ever so slightly when I tried to lift it back into place. I had struggled with that gate for weeks, its hinges rusted from years of rain and neglect, but I kept telling myself I could manage it on my own. When he appeared, carrying nothing more than a set of tools and a smile that felt both familiar and disarming, I felt a strange mixture of embarrassment and relief. He asked if I needed help, and before I could protest, he was already kneeling, examining the damage with the steady confidence of someone who had fixed far heavier burdens in life. I stood nearby, watching the ease with which he worked, and I realized it had been years since anyone had looked at me with that quiet patience that says, "Your struggle matters to me." When the gate finally closed smoothly again, he laughed, a sound rich and unguarded, and asked if I might offer him a glass of water in exchange for his labor. I invited him to the porch, where, instead of water, we shared coffee, and the hours slipped by unnoticed. He spoke of small things at first, the kind of conversations that carry no weight, yet leave you lighter for having had them, and I found myself answering more freely than I had in years. My children often visited with clipped words and hurried schedules, their eyes always darting to phones or clocks, but Mateo listened without distraction, as if every word I spoke deserved a place in the air between us. There was no romance in those first days, only a friendship that felt like sunlight, slowly returning to a room long kept shuttered. He began to stop by more often, sometimes with a basket of fruit, sometimes with nothing but his company. And together, we would walk through the garden, his laughter loosening the grip of loneliness that had been strangling me since Raphael's death. I told myself not to read too much into the warmth I felt, that he was simply kind. But late at night, when the house grew quiet, I caught myself remembering his eyes, the way they seemed to hold both gentleness and strength. And for the first time in years, I wondered if life might still hold something tender for me. I tried to tell myself it was only friendship, that the warmth I felt when Matteo's laughter carried across my garden was nothing more than gratitude for the company he offered. But as the days stretched into weeks, I could no longer deny the truth that stirred restlessly in my chest. I was falling in love, and the realization came to me not in a grand moment, but in the quiet spaces, when his voice echoed in my mind long after he had gone, or when I found myself setting an extra cup on the table before remembering that he might not come that day. It shamed me at first, this awakening that felt both tender and reckless. For I was 68 and he was 45, and I could already hear the whispers of the world ready to sharpen their tongues. A man who loses his wife and later finds solace in the arms of someone younger is applauded for moving on, for proving that life still courses through his veins. But a woman who does the same is called foolish, desperate, a cautionary tale of vanity refusing to accept its season. I carried those judgments in my bones, the voices of neighbors, relatives, even my own children, and at night they pressed on me like stones. Yet when I was with Matteo, those voices fell silent, replaced by the steady hum of life returning to me, a rhythm I had thought was buried with Raphael. There was no shame in the way he listened, no hesitation in the way he respected my silences, no mockery in the way his hand brushed mine when he passed me a cup of coffee, as though that small gesture was sacred. In his presence, I did not feel like a relic of the past, but like a woman still breathing, still capable of being seen, still worthy of joy. I walked through town with my head lowered, afraid that others might notice the flush in my cheeks. Yet within my home, I allowed myself the fragile gift of smiling without reason, of humming while I cooked, of dreaming beyond the narrow script others had written for widows like me. I told myself it could not last, that the world would intervene, but still, my heart betrayed me. With every glance at his brown eyes, with every memory of his laughter, and I realized with a trembling certainty that I had been given something rarer than approval. I had been given love again. It was Lucia who first confronted me, her voice sharp as broken glass the moment she stepped into my kitchen and saw the second coffee cup drying on the rack, her eyes narrowing as if I had committed a crime rather than shared a simple morning with someone who cared for me. She demanded to know who it belonged to, and when I told her it was Matteo's, her face flushed with disbelief and fury, as though I had betrayed her personally. David followed soon after, his words less fiery, but no less wounding, his disappointment heavy in the air as he asked me how I could so quickly dishonor the memory of their father, how I could allow a stranger, and worse, a younger man, to invade the sanctity of the home Raphael had built with his hands. Their accusations struck me harder than any storm, for beneath every word was the unspoken judgment that I was foolish, that at 68, I had no right to seek companionship beyond the role of grieving widow. They looked at me not as their mother, the woman who had raised them through lean years and sleepless nights, but as some reckless old woman blinded by the flattery of youth. The sting of their contempt burned deeper than I cared to admit, for I had always hoped my children would be my refuge in age. Yet in that moment, they became my judges, measuring my choices against a scale weighted with their own fear and pride. I tried to tell them that love is not bound by calendars, that joy does not check a birth certificate before it enters your heart, but they shook their heads, their mouths, hard lines of disapproval, refusing to hear me. I wanted to scream that they knew nothing of the silence I had endured since Raphael's death, nothing of the hollow mornings where his chair sat empty, nothing of the ache that spread like ivy through the walls of this house. Instead, I stood quietly, swallowing my pain like bitter medicine, realizing with sorrow that in their eyes, my dignity was tethered to absence, that I was to remain cloaked in grief so they might feel their father's memory was protected. Yet as they stormed out, leaving the echo of their anger behind, I felt a small flame inside me, refusing to die, a stubborn reminder that I was still a woman, still alive, and still deserving of love, no matter how much it offended their fragile pride. The night of the dinner is etched into me like a scar, for I had prepared the table with the hope that food might soften the edges of my children's anger, that the familiar comfort of rice, steaming in clay pots, and fish, grilled the way Raphael used to like it, might remind us that we were still a family, still bound by more than suspicion. Matteo sat beside me, his posture careful, his hands resting quietly in his lap, as though he already knew the storm that waited for him. And across from us, Lucia's eyes blazed with accusation, while David's silence hung heavier than words. For a few minutes we moved spoons and filled bowls, the clink of porcelain masking the tension, but then Lucia's voice cut through the air with the precision of a knife. She leaned forward, her lips curled into a bitter line, and called him a gold digger. The word spat like poison, her tone dripping with contempt, as if she had unmasked a villain no one else could see. I felt Matteo flinch beside me, not outwardly, but in the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his smile faltered for a moment, before he straightened himself with dignity. David finally spoke then, his voice low but stern, demanding to know what Matteo was after, asking if he wanted the house, the land, the savings their father had spent his life working for. Their words rained down like blows, not only upon him but upon me, for with every accusation they painted me as a fool, a woman too blinded by loneliness to recognize deceit. I defended him as best I could, telling them he had asked me for nothing, that his kindness was not measured in money, but in the simple gift of presence, in the way he sat with me through afternoons when grief felt like it would smother me. Yet my words slid past them like water against stone, their faces set in unyielding judgment, their ears deaf to anything but the echo of their own fears. I realized then, with painful clarity, that this was not about love, not about protecting their father's memory, but about control, about their desperate need to hold the reins of my life so they could keep their inheritance safe and their pride intact. As I sat there, crushed beneath the weight of their betrayal, I understood that my children no longer saw me as their mother, but as an obstacle to be managed, a woman whose choices could not be trusted, and that revelation broke something inside me that would never be repaired. I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that my children's fury was born of grief, that their sharp words came from a place of wounded loyalty to their father. But one evening, when I rose quietly from my chair to fetch a blanket, I heard them speaking in the hallway, and the truth fell upon me, like a stone dropped in deep water. They did not know I was listening, their voices low yet edged with urgency, and it was Lucia who said first what had been coiled in their hearts all along, that if I let Matteo stay close, he would take everything, the house, the land, the savings, every piece of security they believed belonged to them. David answered her with the same bitterness, muttering that he had worked too hard in his own life to watch his inheritance vanish into the pockets of a younger man who knew how to charm an old woman. My chest tightened at those words, not for the insult of being called old, but for the revelation that my worth to them had been reduced to assets, to a ledger waiting to be balanced. I pressed myself against the wall, my fingers clutching the fabric of the blanket, as though it might anchor me while their whispers sliced through the dim light like blades. I had thought they were angry because they feared I had forgotten their father too soon, that they were ashamed of how the world might look at me. But in that instant, I knew with a clarity that stole my breath that their anger was not about love at all. It was about money. Betrayal flooded me, heavier than any grief I had carried. For what mother wants to believe that her children see her life as currency, her happiness as a threat to their inheritance? The tears that gathered in my eyes were not for Raphael, nor for the years I had lost to loneliness, but for the cruel realization that the people I had raised, the ones I had given my body and soul to protect, were guarding not my dignity, but their future wealth. I wanted to step into the hallway, to confront them, to demand they look me in the eyes as they carved up my life into portions to be claimed. But I remained frozen in the shadows, silent and unseen, listening as they plotted against a love they could not comprehend. And in that silence, a new kind of sorrow bloomed, one that told me I was no longer their mother, but their obstacle. I did not tell Lucia or David where I was going that morning, only that I had errands to run, and I carried their whispered fears with me like a wound that would not close. My steps led me not to the market or the church, but to the office of Carmen Reyes, an old friend who had been our family lawyer since Raphael and I first scraped together enough to buy the land this house sits on. Carmen had aged, her once black hair now streaked with silver, but her eyes were as sharp as ever, eyes that had seen too many families torn apart by greed and silence. She greeted me, not as a client, but as a sister in need. And when we sat together, in the quiet of her office, surrounded by shelves heavy with books and the scent of old paper, I felt the weight of my years pressing down on me. I told her everything, how my children had accused Matteo, how they whispered in the dark about inheritance as though I were already buried, how they treated me less like a mother and more like a vault of treasure they were desperate to guard. Carmen listened with the patience of someone who had heard such confessions before, nodding slowly, her hands folded on the desk until finally she said what I had never dared to consider, that the power was not theirs, it was mine. She pulled out the papers Raphael and I had signed long ago, the will, the deeds, the accounts, and one by one she explained what each line meant, showing me that nothing could be touched without my consent, that I was not a bystander in my own life, but the keeper of every key. As she spoke, I felt something stir inside me, a strength I had not known since Raphael died, a realization that my children had built a story of my weakness to justify their grasping hands, but in truth, the law stood firmly on my side. Carmen advised me to make changes, to protect what was mine in ways they could not undo. And as her pen scratched across fresh documents, I understood that I had been living under the illusion that love must always yield to the demands of blood. Leaving her office, the air felt lighter, and though my heart still ached from the betrayal of my children, I knew with sudden certainty that I was not helpless, and that perhaps it was time they learned it too. I walked home from Carmen's office that day, with my heart steady and my mind clearer than it had been in years. The papers folded neatly in my handbag, like hidden weapons, silent but powerful. For so long I had believed that the only choice left to me was submission, that my children's voices were louder, stronger, and destined to drown out my own. Yet now I carried proof that I was not powerless, that the years I had spent building this life with Raphael were not theirs to dismantle as they pleased. Carmen had guided me with the calm assurance of a friend who knew both law and love, showing me how to restructure the estate, how to move the land and savings into a trust that answered only to me, how to seal the doors of my legacy so tightly that no hands but mine could open them. Signing those documents had felt like breathing after years of suffocation. Each stroke of ink, a quiet rebellion against the chains of expectation. Each signature a reminder that I was not only a widow to be pitied, but a woman capable of protecting what was rightfully hers. I did not tell Lucia or David what I had done. Not yet, for part of me wanted them to continue believing their whispers had gone unheard, that I was still the fragile mother they could push aside and manage like a piece on a chessboard. Let them think I was weak, I thought. Let them believe I was still trapped in their shadow, because one day they would discover that while they plotted, I had already turned the tables. There was a bitter satisfaction in knowing that their inheritance, the prize they guarded more fiercely than my happiness, now lay beyond their reach, locked away by my own hand. This was not cruelty, though some might call it so, but justice. A balancing of scales long tilted against me. A way of reclaiming dignity in a world determined to strip it from women who dared to outlive grief. At night, when the house was quiet and only the sound of the crickets filled the air, I would sit by the window with a cup of tea and feel the secret burn inside me like a small fire, warming the parts of me that had grown cold with despair. My revenge was not loud or violent, it was silent and precise. Like the shifting of tides, no one notices until the shore has been remade. David came without warning one afternoon, his knock heavy and impatient, the kind of knock that announced judgment before a word was even spoken. And when I opened the door, his face was already set in anger, his jaw tight, his eyes flashing with the authority he believed he still had over me. He did not sit, did not greet me, did not even ask how I was, but marched straight into the living room and demanded that I end things with Matteo, his voice trembling with the certainty that he had the right to dictate the course of my life. He spoke of shame, of what people must be saying, of how his father's memory was being trampled. But beneath the anger, I heard the same wordless panic I had overheard in the hallway that night. The fear that I was slipping beyond his control and that the life he had counted on inheriting was no longer his to claim. I told him calmly that my choices were mine alone, that Matteo had brought me nothing but kindness and respect. But he dismissed my words as though I were a child, shaking his head and muttering that I was blinded, that I did not know what was good for me. He left as abruptly as he had come, his footsteps echoing down the hallway like thunder, leaving the house thick with the residue of his contempt. Not long after, whispers began to find their way back to me. Carried by cousins and neighbors with hesitant eyes, whispers that Lucia had been busy feeding to anyone who would listen. She called me desperate, said I was being taken advantage of, that I was embarrassing the family with my foolishness, and though the words were spoken behind my back, I felt them clinging to me like smoke, staining every room I entered. It hurt, of course it hurt, to be painted as a fool by the very children I had raised with my own hands, to have the years of sacrifice erased by gossip that reduced me to a caricature of loneliness. But instead of breaking me, the sting of their betrayal carved something sharper inside me, a steel that steadied my spine and kept me from bowing under the weight of their scorn. I understood then that humiliation only has power if you bend to it, and I chose instead to stand taller, to let their cruelty harden my resolve like fire tempering iron. The family gathered that Sunday in the same dining room where so many birthdays and anniversaries had been celebrated, the walls still holding echoes of Raphael's voice, and though I knew the air was heavy with suspicion, I also knew it was time to speak plainly. I had asked Matteo to come with me, his hand warm in mine as we entered, and I could feel the hush ripple through the room as eyes fell on us together, curiosity mingling with unease. The table was set with dishes that once symbolized unity. Yet, as I looked around, I saw only divisions carved into faces, my relatives whispering to one another. I did not falter. When the meal was served, and the clatter of plates softened into silence. I stood and introduced Matteo, not as a friend, not as a visitor, but as my partner, the man who had brought light back into days that had been drowning in shadows. The silence that followed was thick, almost tangible, broken first by the sharp scrape of Lucia's chair against the floor as she rose, her face crimson with fury, her voice trembling as she accused me of humiliating the family, of dishonoring her father's memory. She stormed out before I could reply, her heels striking the floor like a drumbeat of disapproval. David's reaction was not flight but fire. He shouted across the table, his words aimed at Matteo but intended to wound me, demanding to know what spell I had fallen under, what poison had made me forget who I was supposed to be. His voice echoed against the walls, harsh and jagged, and for a moment, all I could see was the boy he once was, crying when his toy was taken, unable to accept that not everything belonged to him. Yet, I did not crumble under his anger. I remained seated, my hands folded calmly, my gaze steady as I told them both that my happiness was not theirs to permit or deny. I felt the weight of every eye in that room pressing down on me, some filled with judgment, others with quiet curiosity. But I did not lower my head. For the first time since Raphael's death, I chose myself openly, without apology, without fear. The storm raged around me, but I was the stillness at its center, and in that stillness, I found my freedom. The weeks that followed my announcement were colder than any storm I had ever weathered. For my children did not raise their voices again. They simply withdrew, retreating into silence that spoke louder than any words, refusing to call, refusing to visit, as though by erasing themselves from my life, they might erase Matteo from it too. At first, I told myself it was only their pride, that in time their anger would soften. But then the letter came, crisp paper, stamped with the court seal, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. They had filed a petition, questioning my mental fitness, suggesting that my choices were not my own, that I was no longer capable of sound judgment, that perhaps grief had weakened my mind. The betrayal burned through me like fire in dry grass, swift and consuming, for these were my children, the ones I had held against my chest as infants, the ones I had nursed through fevers and heartbreaks, and now they were telling the world that I was unfit to steer the course of my own life. I sat with that letter in trembling hands, the words blurring as tears gathered in my eyes, and I wondered how it was possible that love could twist itself into something so cruel that the bond of blood could be wielded as a weapon. Yet beneath the devastation was a stubborn flame, a refusal to bow to the story they were writing about me. I was not senile. I was not fragile. I was not a woman to be tucked into a corner, while others decided her fate. I remembered Carmen's steady voice reminding me of my rights, of the strength I held even when I thought myself powerless, and I clung to that memory as armor. If my children wanted to fight me in court, then they would see that the mother they thought could be silenced still carried a voice sharp enough to cut through their lies. It grieved me to imagine strangers debating my sanity, to think of neighbors whispering, yet I chose not to hide, for to hide would be to agree with them, and I would not let them erase me. My life was not theirs to govern, and if it required me to stand before a judge to prove that, then I would do so with my head high, even if my heart broke in the process. The morning of the hearing, I rose before dawn, the house still wrapped in silence, and dressed with a care I had not shown myself in years, choosing a simple navy dress and the pearl earrings Raphael had given me on our 20th anniversary, as though their quiet gleam might remind me that I had once been cherished beyond measure. Carmen arrived promptly, her presence steady as the tide, and when she took my arm outside the courthouse, I felt the strength of her friendship flow into me, a reminder that I was not walking into this storm alone. Inside, The room smelled of polished wood and old paper, the walls lined with portraits of judges long gone, their faces frozen in authority, and I could feel the weight of history pressing on me as I took my seat. Lucia and David were already there, their eyes avoiding mine, their mouths hard with determination, and for a fleeting moment, I saw not the children I had raised, but strangers who had come to dismantle me piece by piece. When the proceedings began, they painted me as fragile, confused, unfit to manage my own affairs. Their voices steady, but their arguments built on sand, for when it was my turn to speak, I opened the folder. Carmen had helped me prepare and laid out the truth with a calmness that surprised even me. I showed the judge my accounts, carefully balanced and maintained, proof that I had paid my bills, managed my household, and overseen my affairs without error. I presented letters from neighbors who attested to my sharp memory and independence, and Carmen read aloud a medical statement confirming my health of mind. Then I looked directly at the judge and told him that my children's accusations were not born of concern but of fear. Fear that my happiness might cost them what they believed was theirs by right. The room grew still as my words hung in the air, and for the first time I felt the weight of power shift, not toward them but toward me. The judge leaned back, his gaze firm yet kind, and after a moment he dismissed their claim, declaring me fully capable of managing my own life. Relief washed over me, not in shouts or triumph, but in the quiet knowledge that the truth had stood tall against their betrayal. When I left the courtroom, Carmen's hand still steady on my arm, I felt taller, not because the world had changed, but because I had refused to let it bury me alive. In the days after the hearing, the air around me seemed to shift, not because I sought revenge or shouted my victory, but because truth has a way of seeping into cracks where lies once held fast, and slowly the whispers that had once targeted me began to turn toward my children, friends who had sat across our table for years, cousins who had once praised Raphael's integrity, neighbors who had nodded with sympathy at my widowhood, now looked at Lucia and David with questioning eyes, asking quietly why any son or daughter would drag their mother into court, why they would attempt to strip her of dignity under the guise of protection. The humiliation was not mine to carry any longer. It was theirs, and though I took no pleasure in their discomfort, I could not ignore the justice of it, the way the very gossip they had sown was now turned back upon them, like a mirror reflecting their greed. Matteo remained at my side throughout this storm, not with grand declarations or defenses, but with the steady presence of a man who had nothing to prove, his loyalty measured not in gifts or demands, but in the simple consistency of showing up, of walking with me to the market, of sitting in silence beside me on the porch when words felt too heavy. His quiet devotion was its own kind of testimony, proof that what we shared was not a scheme or a game, but something real and tender, built not on what he could take from me, but on what he freely gave. I thought often of Raphael in those days, of how he had carried himself with quiet strength, and I realized that Matteo, in his own way, honored that legacy by loving me with patience and respect rather than possession. The more others saw, the clearer the truth became, until even those who had doubted began to soften, offering me small nods of encouragement at church, stopping me at the store to say they admired my courage. I knew the story of what had happened would ripple outward, altered and colored by many mouths. But I also knew that no matter how it twisted, the heart of it would remain, that I had stood firm against betrayal and chosen not silence but truth. And truth, I had learned, always finds its way into the light, no matter how fiercely others try to bury it. When the dust of the courtroom settled, and the silence between my children and me grew too heavy to bear, I knew it was time for a change. Not a retreat, but a step into something new, and it was Matteo who first suggested we look for a place by the sea. I had not lived near the ocean since my girlhood. Yet when we drove to the coast, and I smelled the salt on the wind, something inside me loosened, as though the waves themselves were calling me to let go of the weight I had been carrying. We found a modest house, whitewashed walls, and a roof weathered by years of storms, perched on a cliff where the horizon stretched like an endless promise. It was small compared to the house Raphael and I had built, but in its simplicity, I saw the possibility of peace. Decorating it became a tender labor of love, for I carried with me not only boxes of belongings, but the memories of two lives, one with Raphael and one unfolding with Matteo. I placed Raphael's framed photograph on the mantel, not as a ghost to haunt me, but as a guardian to bless this new chapter, and I draped the quilt his mother had stitched across the bed, its worn threads, a reminder of roots too deep to sever. Yet alongside these tokens I added new colours, vases of wildflowers, Matteo and I picked from the fields, shells we gathered on evening walks, and a painting of a sunrise that spoke of beginnings rather than endings. Each room became a weaving of past and present, sorrow and joy, proof that love does not erase what came before, but makes space for what follows. At night, as the tide whispered against the rocks, I would sit on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders and feel both men with me, one in memory, one in flesh, and I understood that I was not betraying Raphael by choosing life. I was honoring him by refusing to let grief define my remaining years. This new home was not an abandonment, but an expansion, a widening of the circle of my heart, and in its walls, I finally found the balance between what was lost and what was still possible. I was no longer only a widow, no longer only a mother. I was a woman who had dared to claim both memory and hope, and together they built a future as vast as the sea before me. I have reached an age where the weight of years presses heavier than the days ahead. Yet for the first time in a long time, I feel no shame in saying I have chosen joy, even if it cost me the approval of the children I once believed would be my anchor. Lucia and David may never forgive me, their pride too wounded, and their eyes too clouded by inheritance to see what I have built. But I have forgiven myself for the silence I once carried, for the years I allowed grief to shrink my world into shadows, for the fear that nearly convinced me I was finished. Forgiveness has freed me more than any courtroom victory, more than any whisper of gossip turned in my favor, because it has returned me to myself. I no longer measure my worth by the roles others assigned me, widow, mother, keeper of memory, but by the courage I found to live beyond them. With Carmen's guidance, I have ensured my estate will not become the battlefield my children hoped for I have structured it, not for greed, but for good. A portion remains in trust for them, should they ever wish to reconcile. But another portion now carries Raphael's name into a future he would have blessed, a foundation for women who, like me, find themselves silenced, widowed, or betrayed, yet still longing for a chance to stand again. In this way, his life and mine intertwine beyond the grave, proof that love can echo forward even when its vessel is gone. Matteo walks beside me through these last chapters, not with grand gestures, but with quiet loyalty, reminding me each day that tenderness is not bound by time. The world may still whisper that I am foolish, but I hear in those whispers the fear of people who have never dared to begin again, who have never felt the sting of loss transform into the fire of renewal. I sit now in my home by the sea, the salt air on my skin, the sound of waves rising and falling like the breath of God, and I know that my story has not ended. It has only been rewritten. I am not too old for love, not too weak to fight, and not too afraid to begin again. And if these words are the legacy I leave behind, then let them stand as proof that a woman's life is her own to claim, even at the age of 70.